Hello, I'm delighted to have with me Jaqueline Roy, the author of the forthcoming The Gosling Girl. It's a fantastic novel, thought-provoking, moving, challenging, and sails into waters that haven't been sailed into before, as far as I know. So welcome, Jaqueline. Fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you, Pete. Lovely to be here.
Great. And I have a set of questions for you regarding The Gosling Girl. This set of questions is by no means the full number of questions I have. But when I read books, my mind boggles with questions all the time. It's such a thought-provoking book, but we have to limit ourselves. And so my first question is, what gave you the idea to tell the story from the perspective of Michelle Cameron, The Gosling Girl?
Right. I suppose when I was in my 20s, I came across the case of Mary Bell, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that was a 10-year-old girl who murdered two much younger children. And one of the things that was so interesting for me about her case, her situation, was that when it went to trial, she was tried in an adult court, even though she was only 10 years old. And the judge thought that the crime was of such severity that he waived her right to anonymity, and that had huge implications for her growing up. And of course, following that, maybe 20, 25 years later, there was the case of John Venables and Robert Thompson, who murdered a child as well. And both of those situations were really interesting to me because they raised huge questions about identity, about the way the media approaches crime, how it sensationalizes, how it's extremely difficult, I think, for children especially to put their lives back together after they've committed a crime. And that's not in any way to detract from the severity of the crime, the awfulness of it, and the consequences for the families of the victims. But it did seem to me that if you name children in those kinds of cases, you put a millstone around their neck for life. And I am certainly not the person I was when I was 10. And one of the things that I was particularly aware of in thinking about writing the book was that 10-year-olds don't have the same conception of consequences as adults do, and yet they were tried in an adult court. So one of the things I wanted to explore in the novel was the consequences for Michelle of her action of all those years ago, and also the consequences of her exposure and what it meant in terms of identity for her.
Yeah, it does seem bizarre and contrary to some sense of wisdom or maturity to impose an adult frame of mind and justice system upon a child and to have them therefore suffer the consequences that an adult would. And I'm not absolutely certain that this happens in all jurisdictions, but it does seem.
Oh no, not at all. No, I mean it's incredibly rare for children to be named. I mean these cases really were exceptional, and in fact in the late 90s there was an inquiry into it, and it was decided that it shouldn't happen again. So that's one of the reasons why the novel begins in the 90s, because okay. It's very unlikely that it will be repeated in the future.
Well, I think you capture the trauma of the occasion. It's almost like a post-traumatic stress type trauma that Michelle Cameron carries with her upon release, and the novel itself is set around her release from detention. And you've chosen to take that slice of time, if you like, primarily when writing the novel. What informed that decision, and was it hard work to get the research right?
It was quite hard work to get the research right. I certainly, prepared for it, and I'd been thinking about doing that novel since I was in my 20s, and I'm now old. So I have, and I've also read around it a lot. I think it's really important to get the research as accurate as you can, but equally it is also a work of fiction, and that seems important too. You know, it's a combination of imagination and research that really creates a novel. And I chose to set it on Michelle's release because it seemed to me that that was the most effective way of exploring questions about identity. And as a writer, those questions, particularly I think as a Black writer, those questions around how we know who we are massively important. And I think that's really what kept drawing me into thinking about what it must be like for a child to lose their identity in such a dramatic and, as you say, traumatic way. And also what it must be like to keep that kind of secret, to know that you can't tell people, because if you do, you risk exposure, and also you risk their horrified response. You risk being alienated from everyone you know. So there's so much to lose for someone in that situation. And the whole business of secrets, I think, is the stuff of novels, isn't it? Particularly crime fiction. It really works through, you know, will they be able to keep the secret? Will they be exposed, etc., etc. So, so that time immediately after her release was really interesting for me.
Yeah, I hadn't myself thought of the confusion that would occur, but it seemed really clear. The novel presents it so clearly that the idea that you have to live as someone else, and especially for young people, the confusion that must generate. I remember at some point Michelle asked her, I think it's her probation officer, you know, can I go back to being Michelle Cameron again, please? That's he's kind of, the answer is just no. And the thought crossed my mind that there's this maybe it's unnecessary, but there's like disjunction in logic, in that the penal system, broadly speaking, punishes wrongdoing, but and let's say lies may be a minor element of wrongdoing, you know, of a small sin, if you like. But on release, she's told she must lie. She's told she must live as a different identity. So, as you say, secrets and lies become an intrinsic part of herself, and trying to find a moral way through the lying, and yet trying to live a life that is a good life, a morally good life. It must have been so difficult for those presented with that choice. Again, it was. Did you? I know you said you thought about it for quite a number of years. Was there any interviewing you did, or did you get any notes from any people?
No, I mean, it's so rare for this to happen, and of course it's no contact is permitted with those children. I wouldn't want it anyway. I think it's one of the things that happens in the novel is that a psychologist contacts Michelle wanting to tell her story. And that is so fraught, because Michelle is thoroughly manipulated, really, by this woman who wants to tell a dramatic story, and one that's sensationalized. And one of the things that I really wanted to stay away from was sensationalism, because that's how the media really distorts those kinds of cases and makes them even harder, I think, for everybody concerned to deal with. So I kept the writing as low-key as possible. And also, it's important to say it's incredibly rare that those kinds of events. So there's relatively little written about it because it's so rare. And I think that means that there's a kind of over-focus on people like Venables and Thompson, and also on Mary Bell, because it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, I take your note. It's an interesting and a good point that there are moral duties to the writer in entering into this sphere, and I hadn't made that connection that the writer would become almost as egregious or sinful, if you like, or as the fictional psychologist should you choose that path recklessly. So yeah, it's a great point. There are a few other characters in the novel who who are presented interestingly, and one of them is the boyfriend Ryan, and now he's a black young man, and when I saw him being introduced, my heart dropped a little because sadly, most books of crime, once a young black man is introduced, the stereotype rolls out and they end up being the perpetrator of some awful thing. And, you know, you kind of grit your teeth and get through it and think, okay, but there are other lives and not all black young men and all this.
Yes.
So it was a relief, I must say, to see how his story played out. Were you aware that there were these sort of traps, stereotype traps waiting for you should you introduce such a character?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I don't think we've said it explicitly, but Michelle is dual heritage. She has a black father and a white mother. And although Ryan's adopted, his adoptive parentage and his birth parentage is similar. And so, yes, I was very, very aware of all the stereotypes that could adhere to both characters and indeed are kind of imposed on both characters by external forces in the novel. I certainly didn't want to replicate those. So one of the things I really wanted to do with Ryan was to make him someone who was sensitive and who was also kind, because those characteristics don't often adhere to young black men in fiction, as you say. And it's important. I mean, that those people completely exist, and yet they've been written out in a way. And no wonder so many people are afraid of young black men if all they ever see in terms of their portrayal is violence and aggression.
Yeah, I was. I've just been reflecting on Jacob Ross's works, his short stories, and he did something that I'd never seen before, and I was thinking, yeah, both yourself and Jacob Ross have started a new wave of writing in which the young black man is no longer seen in those narrow stereotypical ways. You know, we all wrestle with those stereotypes. They're there, and we have to deal with them as writers. It's the path we take in dealing with them. Like you said, the sensitivity of Ryan was something that's rarely seen in mainstream literature. I want to get a little bit technical now.
Yes.
You could, I mean, some writers are and some are not, but I just asked the questions and there's no right or wrong answers. But one thing that intrigued me about the novel was that it's written in, let me get this right, the third person, primarily she, present tense. So it's the third person present tense, which was a really interesting and rarely used method. What made you choose that?
Well, I experimented with quite a lot of different narrative voices as I was drafting the novel. And one of the things about, say, the first person present tense, which I deliberately rejected, is that the reader can only know as much as the character knows. And of course, it happens in real time, which is very interesting to me as a writer. But what I found was when I used the first person present tense, the writing kept slipping over into melodrama, which I really didn't want it to do because Michelle's experiences were quite extreme. And if you're using a first person present narrative voice, the character hasn't processed events, they're living them in the moment. And I thought that was just too difficult given the dramatic weight of all the material that I had. So then I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? And it seemed to me that by moving into the third person, there were a number of advantages. One was that I could have other characters' perspectives in it. So other characters could evaluate Michelle, and then the reader could decide whether or not they agreed with these characters' evaluations, given that they had kind of seen what was going on in Michelle's head. And of course, the characters couldn't see that. So that was one of the reasons for going into the third person. And I rejected the third person past tense. And the reason for this is when you have sorry, if I think I said, yeah, when I rejected the first person pass, because when you have a first person narrative voice, it's a retrospective narrative if they're telling the story of how things were for them. And implicit in that is the idea that the character came through to the other side and processed the events and is now looking back on them. And what I wanted to do was to show events through Michelle's eyes that she hadn't yet processed. I'm sorry, I've got a barking dog. So I didn't want, I wanted Michelle not to have processed events. I wanted the reader to feel the kind of tension and immediacy in terms of her contact with people and the various obstacles that came her way, because that, I think, created suspense in the book as well, and that seemed important.
Yeah, and I also saw the just today I was rereading. I was saying a little bit of it, and I saw these flash forwards. You know, that later she would. You know, and I thought this third person allows that. It allows the present tense, but a movement forward occasionally that is kind of authorial, but it blends well with the text. It's not a sort of startling thing that perhaps couldn't happen. But that's intriguing. Yeah, that's really interesting. The thought process that went on, and then the other technical question, or I don't know if it's a technical question, but I was intrigued. I've always been intrigued because I write crime fiction, and I'm always interested in how people create suspense, tension, which is kind of one of the most common elements of crime fiction. And I would ask you, how did you build tension in the novel? Because early on, I must say that I was, again, on rereading, I thought, yeah, I know, I saw a little bit more what you were doing. The sort of chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. There is this danger. There's a danger there for the reader that Michelle will slip and fall, and that she may do something that is very large and unfortunate and criminal. And it started to remind me of Patricia Highsmith. I know Jaqueline Roy. I always reference.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm always interested in these things. Go on.
But you know how you get cooked as a reader, and you end up sort of you get the book and you're shouting at Michelle. No, Michelle, stop! Don't do that! Stop drinking now!
Yes.
You start telling her, and that's always a sign for me that I'm really totally engaged. But that suspense in the early session, was that something you did consciously, or was it something that just arose?
Yes, it was something I did consciously. I think, I mean, there were a number of reasons for that. One reason was that I wanted to carry the reader along with me, and one way of doing that is to create, dangerous situations for your characters to be in. And of course, it also fits with what Michelle's life has been like. She's kind of lived life on the edge in many ways, and one of the things I think that happens to people when they're institutionalized, particularly when it happens for children, is that they don't grow into adult very easily. So a lot of Michelle's responses are still childlike. She hasn't got full control of her emotions. She doesn't really understand the world, and that is going to trigger some quite kind of unrestrained responses sometimes in her. So that seemed important. I think the other way of creating suspense in narratives is around pace. And it was a bit of a dilemma for me because the novel isn't straightforward crime fiction. It's the crime's already been committed, and most crime fiction works on the basis of the detective comes in, works out who committed the murder, and all the ends are tied up, orders restored, and end of story. I think for Black writers that's a real difficulty, and partly it's a difficulty because as communities we have had encounters with the police that have been really unfair, unjust sorts of encounters. And I think it makes us really distrustful of the police. So it's then very hard to create a narrative that goes down the conventional crime fiction route, which is the police are good and they fight to bring justice, and all perpetrators are bad and evil, and they should be put away forever. I didn't feel I could go down that route as a Black person. because it's just not our experience of the world. So once you're not doing that, it creates a narrative that in many ways has and needs lots of spaces in it. So on the one hand, there's quite a fast pace going on. And on the other, there needs to be spaces for the reader to reflect on what's happened and to work out how far they trust the events that they've been presented with. So I think on the one hand, I was deliberately and strategically creating suspense, but on the other, I was also inviting the reader to challenge the events that were going on in the novel, rather than just taking them for granted and feeling that because I've said it as a writer, it's automatically true. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one of the great keys, the great ways in which we as readers are kind of locked into the book. We keep reading on to resolve some of those uncertainties of what has happened in the past. And I did feel that the reader is positioned in a way that they have to earn the right to know what actually happened. In some senses, the reader is rather like the psychologist who's sort of living off this in a kind of unfair way, living off Michelle's life, or attempting to, and the sort of prurient interest or whatever. And so that suspense, but that pausing of any reveal, if you like, was really seemed appropriate. And the way in which eventually, I don't want to blow the whole plot in case people are listening, but the way that it does come out, it comes out of a kind of a true moral path, rather than those with a kind of false interest, if you like, a morally false interest. I think Natalie to some extent, and the psychologist to some extent, all those people, almost vampires around Michelle, they're trying to live off her in some way or another. It was not they who received the information, it was the boyfriend. And yeah, that was a really astute and just so, felt right move. So when it comes to the setting now, I noticed it was set in London. What made you set it in London? And I'm not sure what experience you have of London, and I mean, it comes across really well. It feels just like a natural setting for her. But I was just curious as to why you chose London and what research you did on London, if any of us ever need to do any research on London.
Well, I was born and brought up in London, and I lived there until I was in my late 30s. And I never took London for granted, and all the time I lived there, I absolutely loved exploring every inch of it. I was so excited by it, and every day that I could, I would just ride buses and tube trains and British Rail round London, and I got to know it very, very well. And it's interesting as a city. When I came to Manchester, I remember feeling quite kind of, I felt really dislocated, but in particular, people who were new to Manchester, because I worked at a university and lots of the students were completely new to Manchester, and they would say, it's so big. And of course, I had the opposite feeling, because I'd come from London. And London really is a place, I think, where you can hide. It's much easier to hide there in many ways than it is in a place like Manchester, which was one of the reasons why I chose to set the book in London. And one of the other things that almost always happens, I think, when a serious crime has been committed, and particularly would in these circumstances, Michelle isn't allowed to go anywhere near the family of the victim of her crime, and that would be quite hard to achieve setting it in Manchester, really. Whereas London is so huge, there's miles and miles between, say East London and West London. They're almost like two different areas, two different cities almost. So it seemed right to set the novel in London. Though I have to say I'm very aware that, you know, so much writing is very London-centric, and that could do with the shift.
I know I set one of my novels in London just to give it a go. I thought I'd been on enough train journeys up and down and spun around there. It did okay. Yes. Coming to one of the locations, I think it's in London. It's called Whitefields, a secure children's unit.
Yes, that's a made up unit. It's actually located in Surrey, in the novel. But,
right. Oh, sorry. Right. Yes. Yeah, that's right. They took a train journey there, didn't they? Yeah, right. That's right. Was it a coincidence, the name Whitefields?
No, it wasn't. It's one of the things that I wanted to do in the novel was to explore the ways that racial elements would intensify the difficulties that Michelle had, and they'd be intensified both in terms of her search for an identity, because I think most Black people, particularly dual heritage people, have to strive to find an identity that they really feel works for them, and that's both a challenge and a joy. You know, it can be really, really exciting to go for that identity. I don't think it's very exciting in your teens. It certainly wasn't exciting in my teens, but you know, because you just want to fit in, you just want to find a neat little space for yourself, and you can't, I think, at that age anyway. But for Michelle, the circumstances are absolutely compounded by the fact that she is a Black child, and she's demonized even more than she would have been if she'd committed those acts as a white child in the novel. And one of the things that I wanted to do as well in it was to look at Natalie Tyler, who's the police officer. I wanted to look at her place within a white institution, which is the police force, and or service as they now call it. I think we as Black people still call it the police force, don't we?
Yeah,
and that's
never
kind
changed.
of talked about in the novel. No. And so one of the things that tends not to happen in crime fiction is that a police officer really learns something about their own life and experiences through an interaction with a perpetrator. And Natalie Tyler has to question all her values and her place, her role, why she's there, the tokenism that's involved, the using of her, because she's brought into this case, which would be very unusual for somebody of her rank, because she's Black, and it's thought that she will therefore have an automatic rapport with Michelle. She'll be able to get things out of her that nobody else can get out of her. And, you know, this is a very, very uncomfortable position for her to be in. And there's a point in the novel where she and Michelle are discussing the Notting Hill Carnival. And Michelle asks if Natalie's ever been to Carnival, and Natalie's kind of hesitant and says, yeah, well, you know, I have. And Michelle eventually works out that she was policing the Carnival and that every Black officer for miles around was drafted in, you know, so that it looked a bit better than having, you know, a sea of white faces policing it. So I wanted to explore those dilemmas. And again, it goes back, I think, to Black writers of crime fiction. How do you do it when you perhaps don't see things, you know, not, forgive the pun, but in a black and white way, in the black and white way that most crime fiction sees things. And as a writer anyway, I see things in grey. I see a lot of uncertainties, and that's what I play with in writing and what I enjoy in writing. So in some respects, the crime fiction as a genre doesn't quite suit the way I want to work, which I think created all kinds of possibilities, but also difficulties as I was writing this novel.
Yeah, I did see with Natalie this phrase professionalism. You know, it was her bulwark, you know, or the way in which she suffered the racism within the force, the people and systems that were doing her down as a police officer. And it reminded me of this, I don't know, I'm going back a long time now, but is it this entryism or Trotskyism, where you're a sleeper cells, you know, like you kind of hold out as long as you can to get to as high as you can and then reveal your true nature, you know?
Yes.
Did Natalie at some point consider leaving the force in your novel?
Yes, I mean, I think she's generally very uncomfortable. Even at the start of the novel, she's not quite secure in her position. She doesn't know which way she wants to go with it. And what happens is that through her interactions with Michelle, she's forced in a way to confront her job, you know, the reality of her job. And that seemed to me to be something that it was important for her to do, because I think for a lot of us as Black people, we're quite uneasy around Black officers because they have, for us, I think, sometimes we feel that they've compromised in a way that's very difficult for us. But equally, I wouldn't like to see an all-white police force. So what do you do? You know, it is a dilemma. It really is.
Yeah. I do remember somebody saying that the writers were here to ask questions. You know, we may not have the answers, but we ask questions. And I think the Gosling Girl has asked me so many questions. It's been such a thought-provoking and thoughtful novel that, as you say, explores the grey. You know, it doesn't simplify things, and at the same time goes bravely into an area that hasn't really been looked at before, and makes some quite trenchant points about how children, such as the fictional Michelle Cameron, have been treated, and by extension how Black children suffer in that system. It's I think that it's a subject that's very, very difficult to write about well. I think there was a phrase that I heard that Black people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and underrepresented in crime fiction.
Absolutely,
weird imbalance. So I think your book is a valuable contribution to the thinking, both fictional and factual, around this subject. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Pete.
I'm sure it will do well. Say well. It deserves a very wide audience. My pleasure to have you here. And I'll go now feed my cat.
I better go and sort out the dog. But thank you very much, Pete. As always, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. Bye now.
Take care.